Welcome back to CBS Sports HQ. If you listened to Jamey Eisenberg last week and you started Bo Nix, you had a good week at the quarterback position. Last week against Atlanta, Nix grabbed his 6th win of the season. He became the first rookie ever with an 80% completion percentage, 300 or more passing yards, and 4 or more passing touchdowns in a game. He leads all rookies in passing touchdowns with 14 and total touchdowns with 19 this season. Definitely a guy you should start this week. But Jamey's start of the week this week, Washington running back Brian Robinson Jr. Robinson leads the Commanders in rushing yards and carries. He's second in total touchdowns. Let's send it to Jamey and Dave for more on this week's Start of the Week. Jamey.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate that. Yeah, it was a great week for Bo Nix last week. We'll tell you why it's going to be a great week for him as well this week. But Dave, let's start with the start of the week because it's been a good season for Brian Robinson. You know, fantasy managers at the beginning of the season were saying, did I draft the wrong B. Robinson? Because Brian Robinson was outperforming Bijan Robinson at the start of the season. But he's had a very solid season, at least 13.1 PPR points in 6 of 8 games, coming off a 14 PPR per game performance last week against a tough Eagles defense. And now you're getting a situation where he's got fresh legs off the mini-bye laying last Thursday, taking on the Dallas defense with tired legs going on the road after a Monday night loss against Houston, and they're beat up. The Washington offensive line is finally healthy, and it's a great matchup. You're talking about a team that's given up 7 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games in terms of the Dallas Cowboys. There's been 5 running backs over that span that have gotten to at least 12 PPR points. So I think that's the floor. I like Austin Eckler as a sleeper this week as well. I think you can use him also. But Brian Robinson is a #1 running back heading into this matchup. I think he's going to feast on this defense. It's going to be fun to see him taking on this depleted Cowboys team.
In their last 5 games, Dallas has allowed at least 18 PPR points to an opposing running back. Do you know the running back who didn't get there? Saquon. I don't know what that was all about. Maybe just, I don't know, division rival showdown. I don't think that's got anything to do with it. I like the fact that Brian Robinson has at least 16 carries in 5 of his past 7 games. We know he can get involved through the air. He's going to score. He's done that in 6 of 8 games. And I think he gets at least 60, 70 yards on top of it, a couple catches. He's good to go as a low-end #1 fantasy running back.
Yep, let's set up for him, and hopefully he does what most running backs have done against Dallas lately. Let's talk about some other starts for me for week number 12, and Bo Nix back on this list. I think you just keep starting him until he becomes obvious. Right now, he's not a percentage that is obvious, but as Jeremy alluded to, he's catching Jay Daniels potentially for Rookie of the Year, especially if the Broncos make the playoffs and the Commanders do not. Let's talk about, I guess we'll go right into Bo Nix. So last time he played the Raiders, he had 27 fantasy points, and that kind of started his stretch in his recent 5 games. And this Raiders defense, as we know, not playing very well, just gave up a 3-touchdown game to Tua Tagovailoa. So you see where Bo Nix is from our consensus rankings, and the names that we're starting him over at this point. Brock Purdy's had a solid season. Obviously, Justin Herbert. I would probably go Herbert, but that's just the consensus. Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield, who was #2 in terms of fantasy points at the position prior to his bye week. So it's a great spot to be in the Bo Nix camp. Another start for me is Kareem Hunt. And Dave, this is a little controversial one. We had a good conversation on our Fantasy Football Today podcast today about this, because would you still start him if Isaiah Pacheco plays? Andy Reid sort of hinting that they'll split time if Pacheco is back, but not committing to Pacheco playing against the Panthers. And that's the key word, the Panthers. They are #1 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So even if Pacheco plays, I am still starting Kareem Hunt as a #2 running back. Right now, he's a #1 running back if Pacheco doesn't play. How do you feel about the Chiefs running back?
I feel the same way you do, and I'd be shocked if they split 50-50 Pacheco and Kareem Hunt. Let's face it, Isaiah Pacheco, he's missed a lot of time. He had a broken leg, Jamey. There's no way that he's going to come back in his first game and look like the Isaiah Pacheco of old. They've got to ramp him up a little bit. I'm sure that Kansas City wants both these guys healthy and ready to go for the playoffs. And how about this? The Carolina Panthers, 9 running backs with at least 13 non-PPR fantasy points against them in their past 7 games. 9-7. That's how bad of a run defense they are.
Yeah, so just keep an eye on the injury report for Pacheco. So we'll just lower our expectations for Hunt, but you're still starting him at least as a #2 runner. Remember, 16's on a bye, so it's hard to get a lot of great running backs in. So you take matchup, you take opportunity, and Kareem Hunt will still have both of those. Let's go to your start list, Dave, and we're going to disagree about one guy on this list. So you got Sam Darnold as a start. We'll talk about him in a second. Tyrone Tracy, Bucky Irving, 2 rookie running backs in great spots facing each other this week. Who do you like better, Bucky Irving or Rachaad White?
I like Irving better in non-PPR, and I like White a little bit better in full PPR, but you heard Todd Bowles talk about getting Bucky Irving more involved, and he leads the Bucs right now in rush attempts, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns. I think he's going to have a great finish to the year.
Okay, I'll take White over Irving in both, but I like both as top 20 running backs this week. Calvin Ridley and Josh Downs starts for you also. But let's talk about Sam Darnold, because you like him, I don't. What do you like about him taking on this Bears defense?
He's playing well enough to not be top 12 in a week with 6 teams on bye. You just mentioned it. He needs to be up there. I think he's been good good, not great. We're talking about at least 22 fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games. Also, at least 32 pass attempts in each of his past 3 games. We've seen Aaron Jones kind of take this nosedive in efficiency, and that's come at the same time when Sam Darnold is starting to throw more. You know how good that receiving core is. Bears defense is getting healthy. There's no question about it, but I still think the Vikings are going to do what they do. They're going to let Darnold throw, and he's going to come through within that 22 to 25 point range. Still the top 12 fantasy quarterback.
All right, give me the under here because there's only been one quarterback so far this season. One quarterback so far this season with multiple passing touchdowns against this defense. That's including Jaden Daniels. That's including Jordan Love.
Daniels got over 20 fantasy points.
Over 20 fantasy points, but only one quarterback with multiple passing touchdowns against this team, and that was Trevor Lawrence. And so this team just does a great job at taking away the opposing passing game and limiting the passing numbers for these quarterbacks. Remember, they held Kyler Murray to under 5 fantasy points.
Well,
Sam Darnold is not matchup proof, so I think this is going to be a tough game for him.
The Cardinals ran like crazy against him, and that's why Kyler didn't do that. If you think Aaron Jones is going to run crazy against Chicago,
when you're number 1 in fantasy points allowed to the position, you got to give him some respect. So when only one quarterback on the season's gotten multiple passing touchdowns against him, it's not a fluke. And so this team is playing really well, and I don't think Sam Darnold by any stretch is matchup proof. I'm sitting Sam Darnold this week. You should as well. Let's talk about another guy that you like on this list, and that's Tyrone Tracy taking on the Bucs.
Do we agree on Tyrone Tracy?
100%.
You like him as a number 2 fantasy running back?
Borderline
He's
number 1
taking
guy.
on Tampa Bay. And listen, that Bucs run defense, once upon a time, it was the best run defenses in the league. Now it's not. And we've seen Tyrone Tracy, tons of work in his last few games. And we've seen it, 14-plus PPR in 4 of his past 6, 17 touches in 5 of his past 6. The Giants with DeVito last year, they ran the ball about 45% of the time. They've been a little bit lower than that with Daniel Jones. I think they're going to go back to running it, trying to protect Tommy DeVito, not have him throw. And that means Tyrone Tracy gets right back in the backfield for the Giants. He had a great game against Carolina. I know he had the fumbles. That stunk. Hopefully he holds on to the ball this week, stays as the number 1 running back for the Giants, top 15 type of fantasy running back.
I hope that they throw him the ball a little bit more because Daniel Jones has not done that. But every time he's gotten 16 or more carries, he's been successful. He should get 16 or more carries in this game. Let's go to the sits for you for week number 12. You got C.J. Stroud on this list as a quarterback that you're looking to avoid. I actually don't mind him this week, but I can understand why anybody would be, why people would be hesitant to trust him. Nick Chubb in tonight's game, DeAndre Hopkins, Jalen Waddle, and Tucker Kraft. Let's talk about Stroud. So he's been miserable lately, but this feels like a good bounce back spot, though, Dave. Tennessee's been terrible against opposing quarterbacks.
They really have. Darnold took advantage of that defense last week, to give you an example. And even if that 77-yard touchdown had counted for C.J. Stroud last week, he wouldn't have had 20 fantasy points. I don't mind him as a bye-week replacement. You kind of said it. But there are so many quarterbacks who are good. Like Darnold, I think, has more upside than C.J. Stroud. And I know Stroud's got a good matchup. He also has Joe Mixon in the backfield. And, yeah, that Titans run defense is good. Joe Mixon's running on everybody. So I think that C.J. Stroud can have a good game, just not a great game. I would try and find a different option.
All right, so you got DeAndre Hopkins as a sit also. Why are we sitting him?
Because he's had under 10 PPR points in 3 of 4 games with Kansas City. And yes, this is an awesome matchup against Carolina. Kansas City should literally be able to do whatever they want. But one of the things that they tried to do last week, and I think they'll try and do again this week, if I'm reading between the lines of what Andy Reid has said in his comments to the media, is get Xavier Worthy going. And if Xavier Worthy gets going, then we're not going to see a lot of targets for DeAndre Hopkins. He only has 9 total in his last 2 games. So I can see Worthy get going. I think Kelsey goes back into the end zone. And I think we see the run game absolutely smash against Carolina. Doesn't leave a lot for DeAndre Hopkins.
I don't mind him this week. You see, we have him ranked in a similar range, and we share the same sentiment. The one thing that I do think we could see, only 3 times this year, as bad as Carolina's defense has been, only 3 times this year has there been a quarterback over 20 fantasy points and a running back over 13 fantasy points. I think that happens this week with either Hunt, most likely, or Pacheco, and this is a good bounce back spot for Patrick Mahomes. I do think he's going to lean on his receivers, and they get some opportunities to make plays, which is why I don't mind Hopkins as a high-end number 3 receiver. Let's look at the sits for me for this week, and I am sitting Sam Darnold, as we talked about. Tony Pollard, Chuba Hubbard, DeAndre Swift. 3 running backs that you probably need to start because of 6 teams on a bye, but I hate the matchups for all 3 of them. Swift is dealing with a groin injury, so keep an eye on that, and Jacoby Myers taking on Patrick Surtain and that Broncos defense. First time this season that Denver is seeing a team for the 2nd time. Myers had 13.2 PPR points against them. I'm going to take the under, and we see a little bit more of Surtain covering Myers in this matchup. But let's talk about the 2 running backs that most people are starting here, along with DeAndre Swift, but in terms of Pollard and Hubbard. Pollard has been miserable lately. Now, keep an eye on Tyjae Spears. That will help him if Spears is out, because his touches have clearly spiked when Spears has been dealing with that hamstring injury. Now he's in the concussion protocol. But he's got 13 total touches in each of his last 2 games. He is not running well, dealing with the foot injury that he's been playing through. And now you're talking about a Houston defense that's number 5 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. When Al Jazeera is on the healthy for the Texans, they have been a lockdown run defense. So I would try to avoid Pollard if you can. And in the case of Chuba Hubbard, you got two things working against him in this week. You got one, the return of Jonathan Brooks, or the debut of Jonathan Brooks. We do not know how many carries he's going to get. It could be 5, it could be 10, maybe more. You also have the #1 run defense in terms of fewest fantasy points allowed to the position. So you got a tough matchup here and the potential of him losing some work. Again, very difficult to get away from running backs like this. He still should be the quote-unquote workhorse there.
Yep.
But our buddy Robert Turbin, who's on CBS Sports Network with us, he said, don't be surprised if you see Brooks get 10 carries. If he gets 10 carries in a game where they're probably getting blown out, we're not going to see the best of Chuba Hubbard here. So flex at best for me.
Well, he might be getting a lot of those carries in the fourth quarter when it's 38-6 or something like that. Like
Still 10 carries off his plate
last week. It is. That's true. And with Pollard, I started the week actually liking Pollard because there was no Tyjae Spears, and we've seen a lot of work for Pollard, but he just doesn't look right. And I watched his film from week 11, and just he can't stop and start quickly enough. And his acceleration is slow. And this whole offense, it's almost revolving around Will Levis at this point, both on the ground and through the air. Makes me nervous to trust Tony Pollard.
All right, so again, very difficult to sit those guys, but if you find other options, that would be the right move to make. That'll do it for us here with our starts and sits. Make sure you check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found. We're helping you dominate your fantasy football leagues as we always do. You'd also check us out on YouTube, where we help you there also. The Fantasy Football Today podcast, scan the QR code as well.